All right, so this week we're going to talk about the blood and the lymphatic system, as well as certain components of the immune system. So you have to excuse my voice a little bit. I'm still recovering from being sick. But here's a list of the learning objectives that we're going to go through this week. Starting off with an introduction to the blood. So the blood is the fluid of the circulatory system. It carries substances through the body. And here is a list of some of the major functions of the blood. It plays a major role in gas exchange, so it carries oxygen from the lungs to the tissues. And then it carries carbon dioxide to the lungs to be exhaled. As far as nutrient and waste transport, nutrients that are absorbed from the digestive tract get transported through the blood, and then any waste products that have to be filtered out in the kidney get transported through the blood. It transports hormones that are produced by the endocrine glands. It creates interstitial fluid, or the fluid that surrounds the cells in the tissues. It maintains homeostasis. It regulates the pH of the body, the cell's water content. It keeps plasma in capillaries, and it absorbs and dissipates heat at the body's surface. It also plays a major role in protection. So with damaged blood vessels, blood clots prevent infiltration of foreign objects, and it plays a role in inflammation. So blood consists of cells suspended in a liquid extracellular matrix called plasma. About 45% of the blood is red blood cells, or erythrocytes, and 55% is plasma. Less than 1% of the blood is white blood cells. And here you can see the breakdown of the different components of the blood. So plasma is about 55%. The formed elements, including the cells of all sorts, is about 45%. And proteins, including the albumins, water, a majority of the blood is just, or a majority of the plasma is just water. Other solutes, such as ions, nutrients, waste products, gases, regulatory substances such as hormones. Platelets and leukocytes are the white blood cells, make up less than 1%. Of the leukocytes, or of the white blood cells, neutrophils are the most numerous, followed by lymphocytes, then monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Later on, we're going to talk about the function of each one of these different types of cells. Erythrocytes make up a majority of the formed elements. So the hematocrit. A hematocrit is the determination of the percentage of the blood that contains red blood cells. So a normal blood hematocrit for a female is 37 to 47, while a normal blood hematocrit for a male is 42% to 52%. So the hematocrit is higher in men than in women. The reason for this is men typically have a more dense muscle mass, and muscle is where energy is produced, so men need more oxygen. So they're going to have a higher hematocrit. They're also going to have a higher concentration of hemoglobin. Red blood cells are anucleate, and anucleate means that they do not have a nucleus. Going back to the hematocrit here, anemia is when your hematocrit is low, and polycythemia is when your hematocrit is high. Another reason for an elevated hematocrit would be traveling into higher altitudes. So if you're acclimating to higher altitudes, you would have an increased hematocrit. So anemia, or when you have a decrease in your hematocrit, could be due to hemorrhagic anemia. So hemorrhagic anemia is when you're bleeding out. Hemolytic anemia is when your red blood cells are bursting open. That's usually due to misshapen hemoglobin. Aplastic anemia is due to aplasia in the bone marrow. In other words, the stem cell that's supposed to produce red blood cells just isn't producing enough red blood cells. Iron deficiency anemia is due to a deficiency of iron in the diet. Iron is required in order to be incorporated into hemoglobin, So if you don't have enough iron in the diet, you're going to not be able to produce hemoglobin, which means that your red blood cell production is going to decrease. And then pernicious anemia is due to a deficiency of B12. Sickle cell anemia is a type of hemolytic anemia. In sickle cell anemia, there's a mutation in the gene that codes for the production of hemoglobin. And with that mutation comes misshapen hemoglobin. So the cells, which are supposed to be filled up with normal hemoglobin, now have this weirdly shaped hemoglobin, and they take on this sickle shape. Normally, when we have diverging blood vessels, the red blood cells just flow through easily, and they can squeeze through the various blood vessels because they're circular. But when you have sickle-shaped red blood cells, the red blood cells get caught in diverging blood vessels, and that can cause many of the symptoms. So hemoglobin. The function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen, and it transports oxygen in hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, there's about 200 to 300 million molecules of hemoglobin per erythrocyte or per red blood cell. Within each molecule of hemoglobin, there are 4 globin proteins, and in the center of each globin protein is a heme group. And at the center of each heme group is an iron. And each iron can carry 1 molecule of oxygen. So we can carry 4 molecules of oxygen for 1 molecule of hemoglobin. A male has a greater amount of hemoglobin than a female, and we already talked about that. The red blood cell life cycle. So erythropoiesis, or the creation of red blood cells, is a 4-day process. Red blood cells are created in the bone marrow from hematopoietic stem cells. The hematopoietic stem cell will differentiate and eventually lead to the destruction of the nucleus. And once the nucleus is destroyed, those newly made red blood cells will emerge from the bone marrow and enter into circulation. Once in circulation, the lifespan of a red blood cell is 105 to 120 days. When the red blood cell gets old in age, the macrophage cells will phagocytose the aged or abnormal or fragmented red blood cells, and that primarily happens in the spleen, in the red pulp, which we'll talk about again in a little bit when we go over the lymphatic system. Hemoglobin is broken down, and amino acids, iron, and bilirubin are released. The amino acids are recycled in protein. The iron is recycled to make more hemoglobin. And then this bilirubin. So hemoglobin gets converted to biliverdin first, and then eventually gets converted to the bilirubin. Bilirubin goes to the liver to be processed. So it's eliminated eventually through the digestive tract as a waste product. From the liver, it gets concentrated into bile, and then we poop it out in the feces. So the bile gets secreted into the duodenum of the small intestine. We'll learn about that once we get to the digestive tract. But that's kind of the breakdown of this bilirubin. If we have liver failure, that bilirubin tends to accumulate in our tissues, and that causes jaundice. And we learned about jaundice when we went through the skin. So here's a diagram of the breakdown of, or the life cycle of the red blood cell. So erythrocytes emerge from the bone marrow. About 120 days later, they become old and weak, and their membranes start to fray. They start to have this abnormal shape, and macrophages will consume them. And these macrophages are in the spleen or sometimes in the liver. When the macrophage breaks them down, they're going to release the amino acids, which are used to make proteins, the iron, which is recycled in the bone marrow to make more red blood cells, and then the bilirubin is then processed in the liver and excreted into the feces.